G'day and welcome back to the Talking Leadership TV podcast series. My guest today is Christina Ryan. In 2016, Christina took one of the most radical steps in her long career of activism and change making. She put the two words disability and leadership into the same sentence. Her next step was founding the Disability Leadership Institute. Now governments and major corporations use the term disability leadership, and Christina shares her experience and leadership knowledge with disability leaders all over the planet. The Disability Leadership Institute has become a global community of disability leaders, supporting each other through a community of practice and member groups. As a specialist coach, Christina now uses her decades of experience built through frontline disability rights activism, community sector management, systemic advocacy, working at the United Nations, and mentoring to build more disability leaders. Today, my discussion with Christina is going to focus on her leadership pathway. Can't wait to share the discussion with you, but enough from me and over to Christina. Christina, thank you for joining me today. This particular podcast is going to focus on your leadership journey, as most of my podcasts do. So let me start at the beginning. Your leadership in its beginnings. Give us a sense of what that looked like.
That's interesting. And it gets back, I think, to that big question which often comes up in my existence, which is, what is leadership anyway? And, there's positions of leadership. So sure, I've had some of those. I've got one now. I'm a CEO these days. I've been a CEO, kind of labelled CEO for, I don't know, 15, 18 years, something like that. I've been in senior management roles for, maybe 25, 30 years, actually. And so that's potentially leadership, except maybe it isn't, is it, or isn't it? And then there's leadership, which is around how we influence the world around us. How do we create ripples? What do we do to interact with the world around us and make it into a better place? And I guess if I look at that side of things, which to me is more what leadership is about, is, I'd be going right back to when I was a small kid, when I was about 8, I guess I started changing the world actively, and making, making a stand over issues that I thought were important. And by the time I was in my mid-teens, I was seriously into change making and looking at what needs to be fixed, what happens. And, that is probably a path that a number of people follow. I had a really big advantage in that I come from a family that's that kind of family. We do stuff. We get out there and fix the world. That's what we do, according to what we think it should look like, which is, somewhat arrogant, you might say. But, so I learned from some of the best, and I've had, in some ways a head start in being able to get things effectively shifted. And I guess I probably started being most proactive. I mean, I've grown up as a feminist, so I've been most proactive in the women's movement. But then I moved in my teens. There was a lot of environmental activism that was going on, not unlike there would be for young folk today. And in those days, it was around things like uranium mining, nuclear weaponry in the Pacific, testing, bomb testing, stuff like that. And we also had, a big, big peace movement back when I was younger, and that was about actually not dying, because we were all going to die. And it's actually an interesting space because, unless you lived through it, you don't really get it. But that was back in the height of the Cold War, when at any moment, most of the planet expected that we might just die, that the nuclear weapons would start hurling across at each other because computers are the things that would make that happen, and that we'd all find ourselves on a planet that was, a cinder block in space. And so there was a huge peace movement. There were big rallies. It was massive, and lots of people did things. And I think in that context, you learn about the sort of person you are. Are you the kind of person who steps up and participates and decides you can make a difference? And then there's a lot of different ways you can do that. Or are you the kind of person who waits for other people to fix things? And, there's probably permutations, let's get away from the binary. There's no such thing as absolutes. But, it was really interesting to me to see that there was a really large proportion of the population at that time that were prepared to step up and say, enough, not okay, this can't happen. Parallels not dissimilar to the current climate change movement, I would suggest. Um, and as I've grown older, I've come to realise that it's actually a very, very small proportion of the population who are politically engaged, who actually monitor things, who check on things, who keep an eye on what's happening and speak up when they see injustice or the path that is going to lead to inequality or some of those sorts of things. And it becomes harder and harder. So it's been a difficult sort of space. And so I've done all of those sorts of movements. And then, of course, about 30 years ago, I started working in disability activism and disability rights, and particularly the intersection of gender and disability. And that led me to a lot of work that was mainly voluntary while I was doing other paid work once I got back into the workforce. But then in the last decade and a half, I've actually combined the two. I've been able to combine my disability rights activism with my leadership work, my paid position leadership work, and being able to use that, which means I also have the great joy of being able to make a big statement about employing disabled people and doing that properly. That is with proper wages, and proper conditions, and not in insecure positions. And that's been a different space, and that's where I'm hanging out these days. And it's where I've gravitated towards now over the last 7 years that I've been running the Disability Leadership Institute. And it's specifically around recognising that there is a very big gap in leadership opportunities, development, growth, recognition for disabled leaders. And so that's what I do now. I've brought all of my things together and put them into that basket, and watching people grow and helping them to develop, supporting them to build and create their own spaces and their own ripples, and then watching them fly is what more can any so-called leader want? It's marvelous stuff. So yeah, I'm a very fortunate human, I guess. It's my leadership journey.
And thank you for sharing that. That what you've done and the context in which you built that response is something that people need to, I guess, engage with a bit more when you're talking about a leadership process. And it is fortunate, I guess, that something that you're passionate about is in the DNA of the work of the paid work that you do. I envy you that chance, because a lot of people get into roles that aren't necessarily what their passion in life is, and sometimes you can't marry the two up. I'm a realist. You can't necessarily bring the two things together, but the context that got you into that leadership position is quite an interesting one. And I would suggest, again, I'm not backing this with any research, obviously, that people that work in that that social good space, the activism, whatever that form of activism is, that can lead to roles in, I guess, the public and private sectors that help to push certain agendas that need to be discussed. And you brought up at the end there the working in the disability sector, and that has now been the focus of your professional career. Now, you've given the very detailed macro definition of leadership, but for you, if I was to get into the weeds just a little bit, what are the capabilities that you see are critical in effective leadership from the experiences that you've had, Christina?
This is a really big one, Eric, and it's an ongoing conversation in leadershipy circles and in diversity and HR circles, and I'm in all of those spaces. And something that I became fascinated by about a decade ago was management theory. Actually, it's 2 decades ago. Okay, I'm just going to fess up. 20 years ago, I became fascinated with management stuff and realizing that management has almost nothing to do with leadership. If you're really lucky, they intersect. But what we know is that they actually don't. They often don't. And we end up with people who feel really self-important because they've got a position that's got a title. And all of the people I've known who are leaders, people that people look to, people that people are inspired by, people that people want to follow, whatever that means, or emulate, are often not people who see themselves as leaders. And sometimes owning that leadership label is one of the hardest things to do, is to own the space, and to recognise the influence, the power that can come with that inspirational, transforming role. And we get managers who actually can destroy people, who can micromanage them out of existence. And so it is a really interesting zone. What is leadership really? And these days I'm a leadership coach and I run leadership development programs. So it's my gig. It's what I do. I came to understand that I had to turn around one day and have a look at myself and admit that I was one of those people that other people followed. And I don't quite know when that realization hit me. It just did. And with it, I felt an enormous weight of responsibility to support the people who were looking to me for leadership. And of course, I haven't always provided it. Sometimes I've been that person who is not a great leader, somebody who actually shuts things down or stops a conversation when it should have happened. But as I've gotten more aware, more self-aware, which I think is a very big factor in good leadership, I've come to understand how to slow things down, how to support people to speak up in a space where they don't feel confident, how to back them. And I think one of the biggest things I've learned over the years, and something that I really have noticed in other people who I admire as leaders, is that it's not about them. Leadership isn't about you. The minute it's about you, we've got a problem. We've got a problem, because that's not leadership, that's ego. To me, leadership is about recognizing the level of power and influence that you carry. And it's come from somewhere. I mean, I've told you some of my history. I've got skills and abilities that have brought me to here and now. Recognizing that those skills and abilities have actually created a situation where people look to me to make change or to be the person who speaks up. Now, I can still do that, or I can actually start creating other people, building other people who are actually able to do that as well. And so, it is about spreading it around. It's not about me. And it's often about creating space so that others can move in and also start creating influence and making change.
Yeah, I really like where you're headed with that. And if you'll allow me, I've picked up two very key issues that you've brought up. One is about what makes effective leaders effective. And I think you hit it the nail on the head, and you didn't use this terminology, but I'll use it and ask you what you think, is about not just being a self-reflective leader practitioner, but asking yourself the questions, could I have done something better? You said sometimes I shut conversations down. Now that's I guess there's a degree of self-reflective and criticism there of yourself, but at least you're awake enough to know that happened, and that you can't be doing that if one of your pillars of effective leadership is trying to help build others. And you can do leadership not always at the front, but being at the back and supporting people that need that step up on the come up. And that's something I often think even effective leaders forget, that we all started at a junior level and had to work our way up through a career. And if your focus in a career is to be a great leader or be someone that inspires others to do or lead to change, then you had to start somewhere too. And you had people that were your mentors and templates and whatever the best terminology there is to get your practice up and going. So that's the first observation. Then the second one that I really like is it's about other people, right? Leadership as a process is a people thing, and you hit the nail on the head. And I'm starting to believe more and more, and this is just a personal thing, that those that really seek leadership and really want the mantle are people that probably shouldn't be leaders for lots of different reasons. Any views on what I've just said there? Do you agree? Do you vehemently disagree?
I do think that. I mean, if we go back to that ego statement, if it is about you, I've met people whose sole purpose in what they think of as leadership is because they want to be famous. Just think, maybe you're not the person. That's it's a conversation I often have with my colleagues at the Disability Leadership Institute. Is some of us end up having profiles. We get a bit of notoriety, and if you're trying to achieve that, then it usually doesn't work. It's about recognizing that sometimes that's where your work takes you. Sometimes it is about the role of stepping up is about you getting in the front. But more and more, I'm also aware that some of the most effective leaders in history have been people who have built other people. They've been alongside and then they've moved to the background. And because I've grown up in movements, in change movements, and I've been a part of various social change movements for most of my existence, well, probably all of it really, I've often been in the room when there's been conversations about, well, who's going to do this? Or somebody saying, well, why is it always me? There's nobody stepping up to take over. And the first question I have is, what have you been doing to create those people? Because people will step up and step in if you step back and give them the space. And so one of the questions I often have now when I support people with things like media training, I don't do media training, but I've done plenty, and I've done plenty of media as well. And one of the things I often say to people is, why is it that you that has to do this particular interview, or the you that has to be out front on this one? Is there really no one else? And these days, when I'm contacted by various media because they know me, so they'll give me a call, I will usually refer them to other people who are the people that they should be speaking to. And there's a number of reasons behind that. One of them is that I no longer have a representative role, so I should not be speaking for the disability community because I'm not actually in that position at the moment. So that's an ethical thing. Let's talk about ethics in leadership. That's huge. But the other one is that there are plenty of other people who could be doing it, who might be more up to date on the issue, who are the people who are coming through who should be doing it. Now, I'm not, by any stretch of the imagination, I'm not done yet. I'm certainly not old enough to be finished yet. And the women in my family go till we're in our 90s. So I've got plenty of decades ahead of me. But one of the things that I am aware of is that my role has shifted. I've changed into a different position. And that my position now is much more one of support, cheering, being the cheer squad, of letting people, helping people to understand what they're actually able to achieve, naming it when I see them do amazing stuff, all of those things, and also being there, which I do a lot, being there for people when things don't go so great, and being that person without judgment, because we've all stuffed up, we've all done stuff that we think, oh, fringe, that really happened. And of course, in the disability community, there's often also those days when we're not at our peak, when we might be tired or we haven't had enough sleep or something like that, and it doesn't quite come out right, and so sometimes we have to just own that that's how we are that day. And so I think leadership really is about, I do something that's called vertical leadership, which is about how many tree rings you're growing and how you progress in life, and it's the way you operate, not what you've achieved, if you want to look at it that way. And there's a shift that you can see, and it's something I always like to do, and it's something I like to talk about when I'm delivering training, is Are you an I person or a we person? And, observing the people around you and observing the people that you admire and are they I people or we people? The I people are there about them. It's their space. It's very narrow cast. They're more likely to shut someone down and not want to hear what they have to say because they think their opinion's more important or they think they're right. But the we people, the people who get alongside people, they're collaborators. They'll actually start asking questions, wanting to know the different perspectives in the room. They become more facilitators than the experts, the judges. And I think, there's some really interesting stuff in that space that we just haven't allowed ourselves as a community to really explore enough. And it's a really invigorating space. It's
Yeah, that
very stimulating and it gives you a sense of deeper conversation, which of course we don't seem to do enough of. Yeah.
Oh, 100% agree. I really like that last point around leadership, the leadership process, and leaders in particular being facilitators of leadership and facilitators of a process, um, whatever that might look like. And it comes back to this idea, and I've spoken to others about this, and I'll test this with you if you'll allow me. Is Are leaders coaches? Are they mentors? Or are they trainers? Or some combination of those things as the situation requires them to be? And I I was really quite fascinated when you said I'm happy to be the cheerleader in the background. Now that takes a high degree of self-reflection to go, you know what, I don't always need to be up the front. And I think as you progress in a career, and I think for me personally, I'm very much in agreement with you. I've tried and had some degree of success as a leader, but now that I'm no longer in the front and I'm doing my own thing, I don't miss that anymore. And I'm glad to help others to be the person up the front as much as is humanly possible to do, because the limelight's great for a little while. Once you have your 15 minutes and you can do some things and make some change and help some other human beings, I think there's a point at which you get a bit over it and you go, look, I've done my bit. I'm not the only one with a view here. There are other people that may have superior views, um, more considered views. That idea of facilitation is an interesting one, and I guess, and I don't think I'm speaking out of school here, that your experiences in change movements would orient you that way, that you want to see what other people have to think. It's not just about you. Otherwise, you're not part of a movement. It's just you with an idea going off on your own tangent. Does that kind of make sense?
It certainly does. There are people who think that they are the only person who can make a certain change. And of course, if
Sure.
how many billions of us are there? There's about 7 billion of us now. Honestly, are you unique? No, no, you're not unique by any stretch. You might be the only one of you within cooey of you, but there's always going to be others out there who have what you've got. I'll go back to that vertical leadership concept, and it is a thing. Google vertical leadership. There's a whole bunch of stuff about it, folks. Without me going into leadership theory, because how tiresome. But well, no, it's just a different conversation to today because I could actually talk under wet cement about leadership. But I'll go back to that concept because what we actually know in vertical leadership is the more developed leaders are, the more they move into what we might call that inspiring leader, that transformative person. The people who spark change. So they might be seen as leaders of movements, but that doesn't mean they're necessarily out the front. And yes, there is going to be a natural connection between that sort of person and being a mentor, being a role model, being somebody who inspires others. Because you're actually the sort of person that people gravitate towards, that people want, people want to be like you. And it's actually it took me a while I still haven't got used to it. I've never got used to it, but it's happened to me a number of times in my existence. Very awkward moments when somebody will come up to me after a conference or, some sort of thing that I've done and say, oh, I want to grow up to be you. And I think, thinking, well, no, you probably don't. There I am sitting there in my very large piece of hardware, and I've got all sorts of things going on in my life that they certainly don't want to have a part of. What they're actually saying is that there's some way that I'm operating that is inspiring to them. Now, I can't name that. Only they can name what that is. Only they know what's actually hitting home and cutting in for them. Well, that's great. If somebody does that for you, name what it is and why. And it's one of the questions I like to ask people, is who is a leader you admire and why? And it often really creates difficulty for people when they start thinking, they know they've got these people in their life that are their role models, their mentors, and I've certainly got some. I've had some of the best. I've been extremely privileged and fortunate in the mentors that I've had in my time. Pretty much all of whom are dead now, because that's what happens. Very sad. But there's some reason why you've looked to that person. There's something about them. Was it their absolute forthright courage? The fact that they took no bullshit, they just get in there and do what needed to be done. They were the one who would get in there and speak. Or was it the way they were always incredibly considered and allowed everyone to say something before they asked a question? Or what? you know, is it the way they made you feel? Because we actually remember how people make us feel more than anything else. That's inspiring. That's what inspiring is. And when we can identify how people make us feel, whether they make us feel strong or brave or make us feel intelligent, whatever intelligence is, make us feel that we have what it takes. That's role models, that's mentors. I suppose role models are people we look to, and mentors are the one we actually end up having a relationship with who give it to us directly, who help us to understand how it might be done. And I think it is very much a part of good leadership, and I'm going to call it good in that context, is to be aware that you will play that part with people. You're going to find yourself in that position. And you've got some options there. You can run away from it, or you can recognise it's there and take responsibility for what it looks like.
Yeah, I was going to say, and you brought this up, and this brings it to the sharp end for me is leadership is a choice in a lot of ways, and when you make that choice, and it's my podcast, so I'll say what I'm going to say next. You take the shit and the good that comes with that, and that there's some responsibility there, because that example you gave, and I think it's a great one, because I've been the person that's gone up to people that have presented and said, I really want to do what you do. I want to be like you. And that is often off-putting for the person you're saying that to, because you're like, what did I do to inspire this? And you're like, well, this is on you, so I don't have an answer for this. I'm going to go outside and grab a coffee. Bye-bye. And they sort of remove themselves from that situation. But when you think about when you say that, yeah, they've triggered a feeling in you that's gone, I'm inspired to do something like what you're doing. And so because humans being humans, we don't often sit back and try and get the right set of words. You'll blurt out what necessarily is on the tip of your tongue and may not exactly be what you meant to say. But I've seen it before in other leaders, and the idea of taking on a leadership position is to take a certain degree of responsibility, because you can't ever get away from the fact that you're dealing with other human beings. And if you're not, then what are you leading? If you're not leading people, then you're doing something, and it's potentially not the leadership process. Christina, let me ask you one additional follow-up here, because we've all been through this process. A post-COVID-19 world, right? We went through COVID-19 being discussed, and it will be discussed for decades to come, I'm sure, on its impact on leadership. From your perspective, do you think, that COVID-19 had an impact on the leadership process in your estimation, or is it too early to tell, or where's your thinking on that?
I think it actually was pretty much up front, very early in the piece. And this cuts back to what we were just talking about, how people speak. There's something about good leadership for me, which is about ethics and integrity. It's about understanding that you have influence and that is front of mind. You don't really have to be switching on that awareness. It's always with you. And there are people who think leadership is about a position of power or having power over others. That's not leadership, that's control. That's a very different situation. And I think one of the things that became very clear very early in the pandemic is that we had an awful lot of people in positions of authority who had no leadership ability whatsoever. And in fact, who were very damaging as a result. In some countries, that resulted in hundreds of thousands of people dying to prove some political point for somebody. Now, that's not leadership. If we look at the ethical element of this and the fact that how I say something, how we talk, that person coming up to me after a conference, the first time it's a bit creepy. After that, you kind of decide you're going to have to work out how to deal with it, is recognizing that one moment in existence that you're currently in the middle of will have enormous influence and ripples for a long time. So the responsibility side of leadership is about recognizing that what you say then does matter. Turning up the next day to say, oh, no, I misspoke. I think, well, who invented that? I mean, what spin? The reality is what you say does matter. How you say it, how you open to people or squash people is all part of it. And I think the pandemic gave us some really good examples of the kind of leadership that humanity doesn't really want, that we don't really feel we should be looking to. And I think it's been evidenced by the fact that since then we've had an increasing number of people that have come to the, sort of come to the fore globally, who are people that people are inspired by. And the first thing that we notice is that those people who are in positions of authority, but they're not really good at leadership, feel threatened. They actually start to behave in a way that's interesting. They shut down conversations or they sling mud. Sometimes they even put people in prisons. In some countries, at the moment in Russia, for example, if you speak against the people in authority, you can end up in prison for it. In other countries, that's also happening. And that's because people feel threatened. They know they're not up for it. So it's a really interesting space. And I don't, you've got to go through stuff to understand how other people feel. It's not just empathy, it's also understanding, it's also a certain amount of wisdom, not necessarily involved with age. It's actually about the way you look at people and how you interact with them. So pandemic's been a nice lesson in leadership, or bad leadership. But it's also been a really good guidebook for us in ways that we might want to, again, going back to that question, why are we inspired by some of these people? What is it they're doing for us? What can we think about that we might learn from that?
Yeah, 100%. I also think in my heart of hearts that those that are the led, our teams, the people that make up our organizations, are human beings that are inspired by you to whatever degree. They're going to set more of the agenda around what good leadership looks like for them. And hopefully those in positions of authority have the nous to listen to that and understand what that means. And a big one for me that I've seen happening is the way we're structuring work at the moment. So hybrid working arrangements, work from home. People are deciding and making it more clear to recruiters and potential employers, yeah, I'd love to work here, but I've got some needs that I need met to be able to give you 100%. If you can't do that, I'll take my labor somewhere else. And that, I think that's a byproduct of the pandemic. As for the discussion around what did ineffective leadership look like, and you made, I think, a really strong and important point that I think needs to be talked about more is some leaders that have the title are necessarily highly paid managers looking to command and control as the way to do their business, whereas good, effective, great leaders don't do that. That's the managerial side of the leadership process is an essential, I guess, to get things done. But that's not where the leadership discussion, the leadership process sits. It sits around people. It sits around uh, uh, a collective understanding that we all have to get to an end point, and how we get there is necessarily pegged out by the leader. But you've got to have people that can make it happen, because unfortunately you do meet some leaders that think they can do it all or have the definitive answer. And what I think COVID did was throw a spanner works in the works and say, well, you've got a 3-year plan. That's now out the window. How you're going to retool to deal with the new environment. I think you've got something to say. So what's your view on that, Christina?
Look, you said something there, Eric, that I think is really crucial here, is leaders who think they've got the answer. And to me, that's another one of those red flags. If you think you've got the answer, then you're probably in the wrong place. Because actually, how is it that you know what the answer is? I mean, we've all got expertise, but there's no absolutes here. We're talking about human beings. And the most effective teams and organisations are the ones where people have a high degree of autonomy, where they're trusted to do their jobs, where they actually choose to follow their team leaders, not where it's imposed on them. Those teams are far more effective. They actually work faster. They do a hell of a lot more. They often look like they're much bigger than they really are, those sorts of teams. And yet we've got people who think they know the answer. And, I actually heard Bill Gates, of all people, talking, a month or so back, and he was saying, if you think you're the smartest person in the room, you're in the wrong room. But he's absolutely right, in my opinion. If there's not someone there that you can learn from, then go out and get some other people around you.
Yeah, agreed. I am a big advocate for lifelong learning. And one of the things that I think I take to heart is, if I'm in a room, whatever that room is, whether it's in a professional context or not, I'm always trying to listen out for a bit of a nugget of gold that I can incorporate in my own thinking that helps me be a better human being. That I think is often a good process for me, because I've never been in a room where I've ever thought I'm it or I'm the smartest person in the room, and I tend to wait and let others speak before I say my piece, because I need to listen to what others are thinking before I just insert a view into the room. Now, that took a while for me to do in my younger years, like I think we all do. We sort of think we have the answer, and then when we're caught out or it's demonstrated to us that maybe there's a better way to get to a endpoint, it's either a defining moment for how you think, or it's never going to impact you. And unfortunately, there are many people that, like you've described, that think they have the answer irrespective of those around them, and they'll get eventually found out. But that has a very darker side to it, and that is the space in which toxic leaders play, and that's a whole nother discussion that we can have around. Well, what does bad look like? And I think, without going into a lot of detail here, I think if you haven't experienced bad leadership, you're limiting your potential growth as a leader yourself, because you need to see what bad looks like to be able, in my estimation, to work out what is good. Because if you've only
I
ever
wonder.
sorry,
I think we've all seen bad leadership. I think we all know what it looks like because it's all around us. It's all around us. It's almost a constant, ever-present thing. And of course, global politics over the last decade, 10 or 15 years, has actually headed in that direction. The people who are really divisive, who need to be in control, and, somehow, they go to great lengths to change the constitution so they can stay there, or they, decide that they'll appoint all the judges to the court so they don't end up in prison. We've seen plenty of it. It's out there, or the people who just make us feel small. It comes in all sorts of guises. I think what we don't do enough of is actually have a conversation about what is good leadership, what is effective leadership. Why is it that some people inspire us? Why is it so changing for us, not just as individuals, but as communities and as population groups, to have those people who make us think and who inspire us and who shift the ground? And for some of us, why is that so threatening? Why is that such a challenge? Is it because it makes us feel incompetent? Is it because we feel that suddenly someone's turned up that we know we just are never going to be as good as they are, in our opinion, good, whatever good is? So I don't think we have that conversation enough about what good leadership really is. And some people just think it's longevity, but the reality is, good leaders sort of fade away because, again, they go into, as we were saying earlier, end up in the background. You don't see them. And even people like the Dalai Lama and Nelson Mandela moved into this kind of shadow space of not being in the front. And they receive visitors. They'd receive visitors, but they don't actually expect to be the ones saying things. I think these are some of the examples we can look to give us a sense of why do we think that's good leadership? Why is that inspiring? Why do we want to be like that person?
Yeah, I agreed. One thing I would add that in addition to that, not having the conversation enough, and I do very strongly agree with you that it's not had about what does good look like, what does it feel like. It's also asking the question of our elders, those that have left the world of work, and saying, well, you're in an industry or multiple sectors for 40, 50, 60 years. What the hell did good look like in that? And there's a lot of our elder statesmen and women that we don't interact enough with. And your example there of people like a Nelson Mandela or others that have gone faded into the background. I think it's more realizing in their circles, and I'm reaching here, but I'll use this example that idea of now sitting back and letting others have a crack is part of it too, because a name carries some weight. If you've done some things in a life or experienced some very harrowing things, you've got something to teach others, but there's also others going through that as well. Like you said, we're not all, if you think you're unique and you're the only one out of 7 billion and you're the shining star, maybe there's some problems with that. You need to get a bit more introspective about things, but definitely the idea of drawing inspiration from others and asking others, well, what does good look and feel like? Why we don't do it more, I don't know. Why do you think? I really don't have an answer for that.
I genuinely believe at the moment, I've been talking a lot this current week that we're in about the sheer amount of work that we do. I mean, particularly as Australians, we all work far too many hours. We're doing too much stuff. We've actually created a world where we just don't have time, where we move so fast. And if we don't move fast, there's something wrong with us. And what that has effectively done is it's prevented us from having time to think, from time to sort of posit, from time to have a bit of a process, a bit of a think, a bit of that introspective moment about why am I thinking about this way? And, we've all done it. I did it last night where we, have some sort of thought yesterday, but then overnight our brain does a bit of processing and then we have that middle of the night moment where we think, oh, hang on, what about this angle? We don't give ourselves enough time. I think it's as simple as that. And we can actually use our 168 hours a week, which we all have exactly the same of. We can use them differently. We don't have to use them the same way. We can slow ourselves down and still get the same amount of stuff done. But we're all rushing around like headless chooks trying to, I don't know what, and It's, Australia's got this massive burnout rate. It's really a serious issue, and I know entire workplaces that like 90 something percent burnout rate. Now, how on earth we expect anything to be coming out of spaces where there's no time to think or do is a thing. So let's give ourselves the space, give ourselves the credit and the respect in some ways. Give ourselves the respect to be able to do what needs to be done without thinking that that requires us to flog ourselves unmercifully. Because again, that's actually, I mean, it's poor management as much as anything. It's horrific.
I'm glad to hear you say that because I can hear in the background noise of leadership and managerial discussions the idea that what we're talking about here is the soft skills and it's not the hard and fast of what you need in the workplace. And I would argue quite vehemently that because we don't have some of these conversations at that degree of burnout and that inability to take 10, 15 minutes out of a day to just clear your head and think is something we don't do as a norm. And I think leaders in particular, if you're going to stay fresh and relevant and grounded in some degree of reality, that if you don't take some time to think about what it is that you're doing and your why, the why of your processes, I think are important. But this is something we're not going to solve here. But it's nice to say out loud because I think it's when you want people to have conversations, the reason they're not sometimes, in my belief, this is an opinion, is that they're dangerous conversations to have because you don't exactly know where they're going to lead to or what is potentially going to be discussed. And that pisses some people off or makes some people uncomfortable. And I'm glad to hear that you're one of the people that is quite happy to have that conversation.
Oh,
And
lean into it.
yeah,
Discomfort. Why are you uncomfortable? Lean into it.
yeah, yeah.
Do it, and that's where innovation comes from. It's the exciting place. Do it. If you're feeling a bit jiggled around, it's like, oh, what's that about?
Christina, final question for you. And I asked this in all my podcasts. The nature versus nurture question. Are leaders born or are they made?
Oh, it's a tough one, and I'm going to go with a bit of both. I think there are people who are in some ways born into it in the sense of privilege, and I would be one of those people. I've been born into a space where I come from a family where every single one of us are those people who can make change. And my God, it can be very difficult when we're all in the same room together because, everybody feels like they know what should be done. Um, but I wouldn't be a leadership coach if I didn't think there was a big chunk of nurture in it. Growing people is possible. If people are given this time, the space, the energy, I think there's a lot more nurture in it than there is, born to it. Some people naturally have talents, but we also all have an ability can be supported. Not everyone's going to end up in the front line or being that inspiring person. I think that is, a combination of factors that turn up in certain people and then gets nurtured. Um, but that doesn't mean that you can't grow into that zone in some way. Yeah,
Yeah,
it is open to everyone. It's definitely open to everyone.
it's an interesting response. I'm probably an 80-20 person, 80% nurtured and 20% there's just some combination of skill sets and people that if nurtured, then so it's almost like the two go together. There's always what's that infinite ability, I guess, for people to shape themselves into whatever they want, but there has to be decisions made about do you want to do that and do you have the environment to do that? Because like you said, if you've got a nurturing environment and you said, have your family around you that are all big thinkers and leaders and have strong opinions and are happy to test them out loud, having the environment to do that's important. And sometimes that's not there or it can be built as in you can build on those networks if you choose to do that. So, Christina Ryan, thank you, mate. Did you want to say something before we finish
No,
off?
I was going to say the thing I will be very clear about is I think environmental factors are massive. One of the things we know in the disability community is that it's the environment that disables us and people's attitudes. So it's not just about toughening up. It's actually about recognising that people might very much be in a situation where they are unable to break through what are fundamentally insurmountable barriers that are being chucked in their direction. And I think that's where we need to recognise nurture means having a space where you actually you have the privilege around you of being able to develop. And I think probably the majority of people on our planet do not have the privilege of that space. And
Yeah,
that's something that we might, as leaders, have a think about creating.
agreed. Christina, thank you for your time today, mate.
Thanks so much, Eric. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you.
These podcasts are not possible without the help of my guests, so I'd really like to thank Christina for sharing her insights into this thing called leadership, and in particular her leadership pathway. If you like today's content, please drop a like on this episode, or alternatively you can help me grow the channel by becoming a subscriber. Stay safe, have a great rest of your week, and we'll catch everyone on the next episode of Talking Leadership TV.